Hello, greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, whichever you are at when entering the sound of my voice. Yes, we move into another region. We drop southeast to the southeast region, probably for the exception of Oceania coming up, the region. Um, this is the region probably one hears about the least. As far as the United States goes, we are very aware of Vietnam, right? Um, although I don't know if anyone could tell us much about it, but that stain on American history. So we know about Vietnam. Nevertheless, it's an interesting region. Interesting region with interesting history, which I am very excited to tell you about it. So turn to page 275 in your textbooks, and for a map with the region included. And I think I'll get that out too. And what I want you to keep track of are the region's boundaries. I felt the author could have done probably a better job at delineating this region, but it includes it with East Asia, which we just left. So basically, the region's boundaries. If you have get that lined up with the camera, you have your textbooks. In the northwest part of the region, you have Malaysia, right? Malaysia. You drop down through the Bay of Bengali. We will go as far south as Indonesia, the Indonesian islands. Okay, and then you got the Philippine Islands, and then going west, the mainland area, which I'll talk about later on in the lecture. And you got other island nations down here, Borneo and Brunei, and so there you go. We'll get to those as well. So page 275, we'll be flipping back and forth to that page as we go along in the lecture. So let's get the screen sharing up, and there we go. Go through the regular drill here. Major heads up terms. Domino theory. This was the idea during the Cold War, an American foreign policy philosophy that if one country fell to communism, the whole region would probably fall like dominoes. Hence the reason why we're in Vietnam. Indigenous groups. Indigenous groups, these are folks that are native to the nation and the culture. ASEAN, the Association of Southern Nations, at the time when it was developed, post World War II, early Cold War association, to stop the spread of communism, right, from Soviets and the Chinese. Ho Chi Minh, a nationalist leader out of North Vietnam. He was the leader, also the military leader of the North Viet Cong, fighting against the Americans. Indochina. Indochina is the intermingling of French and Chinese cultures during the French domination of the Vietnamese peninsula, right? French occupation, right? More formal way of saying that. The boat people, once the North Vietnamese ousted the Americans from the southern half of Vietnam and took over the entire peninsula. A lot of Vietnamese were helping the Americans out. and were just basic capitalists, and also Chinese, the Chinese capitalists too. We'll get to that a little bit too, a little bit later. All fled because they knew that once the communists had taken control, administratively brought the military down to the peninsula to reap the spoils of victory, that they would probably be in prison at best, more likely assuming room temperature. The Rohingyas. This is a Muslim minority in Myanmar. Okay, we'll talk about them at some length. Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi, otherwise known as Lady Sue, becomes the first and only prime minister, female prime minister of Myanmar. And I will spend some length talking about her. Tatmadaw, this was the Burmese military in Malaysia, basically setting up an army state. Green Revolution is mechanization, new mechanization in the region that fostered good irrigation practices, up-to-date irrigation practices, and just to raise agricultural production. And paddy is rice cultivation, one of the major sources of cultivation in that particular region. So where do we want to go this chapter? Well, I want to trace the region's cultural history, as we always do, examine the effects of communism on the region, and recognize the region's global ties. So just kind of setting up this first section here, I want to say that South Asia and the Pacific, they lie along a transition of environments and peoples. And again, you'd have your map open to page 275. The region is one of contrasts. Some countries are among the world's wealthiest, while others are among the world's poorest. There are many indigenous groups practicing traditional and tribal lifestyles, but the region's playing an increasingly larger role in global affairs and economics. In fact, until recently, this region was characterized by geographic isolation and a history of domination by external powers. The Europeans, as you probably would have guessed, the Chinese, and South Asian influences have played a significant role in defining the cultural, political, and economic character of the region. Say one more thing here as a setup here. Malaysia and Singapore are your more developed countries of Southeast Asia, whereas Cambodia and Myanmar are among the LDCs, the less developed countries. MDCs will be your more developed countries, as I referenced that too. Among the most populous countries in the region are Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, right, are either approaching 100 million or have already passed that milestone. Let's delve into the X-ray here of the material I want you to know. So a world of influences, and you have a short set of notes here. To combat the U.S. fear of a domino theory, again, that's the spread of communism, was a policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. And that was kind of the major watchword for the U.S. right after the shooting stopped at World War II, as we knew I had a pretty good inclination of Joseph Stalin's inclinations of where he wanted the USSR, the Soviet Union's influence to go. And it was to contain that, right? Containment, the policy of containment. And then shortly thereafter, as pertains to the focus of our focus of study this week, is ASEAN. All right, ASEAN, the Association of Southern Asian Nations, was established to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. Cultural history and colonization. Well, you have the Khmer people, the Burmese, the Thai, and the Vietnamese empires. Subsets of that, you have the Mon and the Khmer people who occupy present-day Cambodia. That was the center of the Khmer Empire between 800 AD and 1200 AD. Then the Red River Valley. The Red River Valley in the north became the center of the Vietnamese kingdom by 1st century BC. By the 1st century BC. And then you have Burma, which is today Myanmar. Burma became Buddhist via Sri Lankan monks. And I know I wanted to say something about that. Yeah, Myanmar was conquered by the British in a series of wars between 1824 and 1855. Again, initially called Burma by the British, after the Burmese, the largest ethnic group. And you can see, I forgot to write the page number down for this, 753, 7.53, gives you kind of a, not a pie chart, but a color key on the ethnic groups of that particular region. So here's the thing with this too. You have many profits that can be made in Asia, especially this region here. You have its tropical agricultural commodities for manufactured goods, heavy Western foreign investment as a result. And on the shoulders of Western capital came the city-state nation of Singapore. All this ended in the 20th century via World War II and anti-colonial movements. The coastal areas of Vietnam were dominated by the Chinese until the 10th century. The area has lasting effects as a result of this, of Chinese influence. The Khmer, Cambodian kingdoms dominated mainland Southeast Asia until the Thai from China migrated to the area. Vietnam, let's look at Vietnam. I'm going to look at Vietnam in a couple parts here. Part one, part two we'll get to a little later. Vietnam, 1858, right? 1858, the French invade, seeking a colonial presence in Asia. The economic prize, the Mekong River Delta, and along with that, just tons of rice cultivation. On pages 330 and 331, you can get a better capsule look at this as a inset map there. But the Mekong River Delta is, I think it's the third largest river in this region, and I think it cracks the top 15 largest in the world. So, yeah, a lot of benefit to having influence in that river region. Stretches out of China, it cuts a little bit through Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and then it empties out in Vietnam. Hanoi becomes the capital of North Vietnam. And you could see figure 7.57, page 329. Give you a better look at that. But the French, they occupy various Laotian kingdoms too by 1907. Laos, the neighboring country to Vietnam. So the Japanese ousted the French in 1941 during World War II. And during this time, a resistance movement from the north, led by Ho Chi Minh, a Vietnamese nationalist, developed against Japan. So after the war, the French, after the war, as we've talked about in another last section, the Japanese were big losers all the way around. So they were deposed. They were weakened and deposed by Ho Chi Minh. But the French were seeking to reoccupy the area once the Japanese were defeated. But by the same forces, they were expelled as well by Ho Chi Minh's forces in 1954. So the North began agitating for reunification in South Vietnam, which led to the U.S.'s gradual involvement in the region because Ho Chi Minh was a Marxist. And although at the time he didn't have any direct ties to the Chinese or the Soviets, yeah, my guess is, and I think the American government felt the same way, that it would be just a matter of time before the Soviets and the Chinese co-opted him into their orbit. So yeah, it was a big interest of the Americans in keeping that from happening. So the domino theory, right? The domino theory, hence, our involvement in the region. At the time, we looked to keep troops out of the region, and we looked to prop up the South Vietnamese to be able to defend the territory themselves. Make a real long story short, they were always very inept at doing that, or not interested in doing that. So enter American troops, a heavier American presence, and then American troops in 1965. And right, as we know, the rest is the unfortunate history to that. But 4 states emerge: Cambodia, Laos, North and South Vietnam. Laos became communist in 1975 via a North Vietnamese invasion. North Vietnam becomes an independent communist state. South Vietnam, up until that point, becomes a client state of the U.S., non-communist. Of course, after 1975, we're out of there. They become a communist state. But before that time, South and North Vietnam became partitioned as a result of diplomacy and the United States, right? The North was aligned initially with China and then later with the Soviets. And when the North became involved with military personnel, concerns about the domino theory began to emerge. Myanmar becomes a Buddhist state via Sri Lankan monks. Yeah, get my spelling in there. I always forget that A. There we go. That becomes Buddhist via Sri Lankan monks. And it was conquered by the British. It was conquered by the British in a series of wars. Okay, I guess we touched on that a little bit a little earlier. Cultural intervention. So cultural intervention here as well. You have, the Muslims arrive 1200s AD, established themselves in Malaysia, Indonesia. Indonesia, the world's largest Islamic state. A lot of people don't think of it that way. They think of those states to be up in the North Africa and the Middle East, but the largest Islamic state in terms of land area is Indonesia. And you can see that at the bottom of your inset map there on page 275. So the colonists and independence. And like I said, there was, much to be gained from this area in regard to, natural resources. Many profits could be made. So who begins to colonize? Well, or what areas get colonized and by whom? The Philippines. Let's take a look at the Philippines first. Looks like a good true false question, if I don't say so myself. The Philippines, Spanish. The Spanish introduced the Roman Catholic faith here, and it's the only Christian nation in the region. Page 292 in your textbooks for a visual. You have a graphic organizer, I suppose it is, on the religious breakdown of the region that you visual types will certainly want to look at that. Philippines were also a Spanish colony until the end of the 1800s. Then it was under American jurisdiction after our victory in the Spanish-American War. Indonesia. The Dutch were colonial rulers after fighting among colonial powers. They set up their headquarters in modern-day Jakarta via the Dutch East India Company in the late 1500s. Jakarta, again on page 275, still the capital of Indonesia. And you can see on the map here, it's probably a little tough to see, but you got the Indonesian islands down here. And Jakarta does stand out, but you kind of have to look for it. That's where it Dutch East Indies set up camp, and it's where the capital is today. Of course, the Dutch are long gone. They granted the Indonesians their independence in 1950. In 1950. Just one more thing, kind of an FYI on Indonesia. Won't necessarily end up on a quiz, but page 310. Turn to page 310 is a better inset map of Indonesia on page 310. I opted to show you Jakarta on the other map because Jakarta doesn't stand out as well on this one here, but this little area up here, this provincial area in orange, okay, it's spelled A-C-E-H, but it's pronounced Aceh, right? Aceh, kind of an interest of mine a little bit as regards Indonesia. The Dutch obviously conquered this whole territory. They conquered Aceh as well. And during the latter part of the 19th century, they grafted it into their Dutch East India colony. But after independence, it became part of Indonesia. So they were promised autonomy once independence was achieved, but they've never received that promise. And part of the problem, I mean, what I find interesting about it is the interpretation of the Islamic faith between Aceh and the central government down in Jakarta. So although Aceh interprets the Muslim faith very conservatively there, they perceive the central government as being too secular, right? Being too secular. So, they'd like to purify themselves, I guess, if you will, from all that. And the other thing about Aceh too is for the size of it, there's not a shortage of natural resources there too, but they don't see much in revenue coming back to their region being as rich as it is in natural resources. So a couple of reasons there they would like to break off from Indonesia. FYI, I like to do those sometimes. Don't have to talk about everything that's going to be in a quiz. Malaysia and Singapore. Malaysia and Singapore again. Map 310. Good inset map there on some of those island countries. Malaysia. Authors don't color code it as well as I would like. Malaysia, here's in Indonesian islands. Malaysia just north of that. Singapore right at the very tip of that. We'll get to that shortly as well. Here's Borneo. All right, Brunei. We'll get to those too. Page 310. Malaysia and Singapore. The British brought Tamil Indians and Chinese laborers to work the Malaysian rubber plantation and the tin mines. Singapore, they're at the tip. They're at the very tip of Malaysia, that peninsula. They withdrew from Malaysia in 1965 as a result of they have a pretty large Chinese identity there in Singapore, and they withdrew because they didn't feel that that was being maintained by the Malaysian majority and the Malaysian government. Now, Myanmar, formerly Burma, that was initially a British colony too. Okay. And you had also there millions of Indians that came to man the commercial industries there. See, at that point, the British had India had become a British protectorate. So again, we know the large population there, and the British were using Indians to come over and help do the dirty work in some of these areas. Indochina, I mentioned that at the top with the heads up terms. It's basically the area of Vietnam, right? When the war ended with the communist North victorious, the country was reunified under communist rule in 1975 and remains communist to this day. Thailand. Like Thailand, we're moving back up to the mainland, but Thailand, go back to page 275 for this. Thailand is kind of one of the odder shaped countries in the world, probably. You have Thailand here. It's in purple in your books. Bangkok is the capital, and the peninsula. Well, not the peninsula, but it stretches pretty far north to south, and it kind of runs into Malaysia, which we just talked about in the pink there. Thailand is the only country in the region that did not become a European colony. I say all that to say that. And then you have your Pacific Islands, right? The United Kingdom, the British, they were the first colonizer of that region as well. Just want to briefly talk about the region's climates. Now, the region's climates are largely tropical. Again, you could look at your map on page 275. Heavily influenced by ocean influences. Most moist subtropical mid-latitude climates are found at the region's northern and southern extremes. Mainland Southeast Asia contains many large sediment-laden rivers. You can look at, while I'm talking about this, page 277, which I think highlights this. The region's home to a wide variety of animal and vegetation types. Numerous mountain ranges and volcanoes are found in the region, the result of movement of 3 major and 1 minor tectonic plate. Earthquakes are common in the region, and a massive earthquake off the Indonesian island of Sumatra triggered a very devastating tsunami. I think it was the day after Christmas, 2004, that stretched all the way over to Africa. Human activity compounds some of the natural hazards as well, like deforestation, some soil degradation. So let's move to, get my way through this. Globalization and local change. Here we go. Globalization, local change. Got a little set of notes there for you. Economic links created during the colonial period between Southwest Asia and the rest of the world lays the foundations for current conditions. The global conditions created by the island nations of the South Pacific were fewer. Took a while. We'll talk about this when we get to Australia, New Zealand, and that particular region. Was kind of late, right? The Europeans didn't pay quite as much attention to them early on. So the global conditions created by the island nations of the South Pacific were fewer, and therefore the impact not as lasting. Population dynamics, population distribution maps and visuals are over on page 276. I would again advise you to, whether you're a visual type or not, I always advise you guys to take a look at those things. Population dynamics, urbanization under communism. It was called de-urbanization. Communists dealt with overcrowding in former Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, by setting up these economic zones. And they would, basically what that meant was divert the Vietnamese families back to their villages. And on page 329, 329, I have that written down. And forgot why I did that, but I'll tell you why here in a second. Yeah, a couple of inset maps of the political evolution of North Vietnam and South Vietnam, right? Or former way of saying it, Indochina, right? You can turn to that and take a look at that. But the Chinese business people fled from persecution in 1977, 77 or 82, right? At that time period there, they were really taking the brunt of the communist persecution, otherwise known as boat people, just thousands leaving, risking life and limb, along with Vietnamese who had helped the Americans out on rafts, trying to get to some other places in the region. In fact, one of my videos I'll talk about at the end of this, I have about a 4 to 5 minute video on the boat people. You'll find that very interesting, has some footage of individuals actually doing this and cameras catching them leaving or entering safely to land. I think it's in Malaysia, but you'll want to see that. You want to see that just because it's interesting, but also because I'm going to want to know about it in the discussion questions. So anyway, yeah, terrible stuff that was going on during that particular time period in regard to this. Population dynamics. Continuing that with geographic identity, Chinese make up about 7% of the population of the region. Ethnic variety, you probably wouldn't guess that, right? Chinese making up about 7% of the region's population. And a lot of that, again, is because of the exodus of the boat people and a Chinese presence in the region has been there for a very long time, actually. Human rights, the Khmer Rouge ruled Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. I'm not making these numbers up. It's hard to believe 1.7 million people died from starvation, disease, or execution from their communist rule. Many of those were Vietnamese, right? Were Vietnamese. You know, it's funny, not funny in a ha-ha sense, but it's weird, it's odd that the United States went over to Vietnam to stop the dominoes from spreading. But what you see happening after the Americans leave are actually the communists fighting one another, right? You see, the Khmer Rouge purging Vietnamese. The Vietnamese had border wars with the Chinese, and so I kind of dubbed this that the dominoes didn't fall, but rather they ended up rubbing up against each other. So kind of head scratching. In 19, maybe it wasn't, maybe it's 2001. 2001, King Sihanouk set up a tribunal in Cambodia to put those leaders on trial. It was actually UN led. It was actually UN led. And I think it actually began the trials in 2007. Most of the Khmer leaders were already dead or in the process of dying. Everything kind of culminated in 2012. Only two of the top leaders were still alive at that point, and they were imprisoned. Kind of adding closure to a very, very, very terrible time period in human existence. I'm going to finish up here by looking at the mainland countries. All right, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. Right, again, page 275. I don't need to turn there anymore. I've showed you that a couple times. You can look at that. But the Civil War, I'm going to talk about internal conflicts. And Burma, Myanmar. Again, remember, dubbed Burma, Burmese, the major people group there, by the British, is today Myanmar. Civil War has been an ongoing thing in the country since independence, right? Since independence from Britain in 1948. You have 100 different ethnic minority groups that make up over 30% of the nation. One of the longest running conflicts involves the Muslim Rohingyas, right? After World War II, they asked for independence or to basically be transferred to neighboring Bangladesh. These requests were rebuffed, and the Rohingyas were branded illegal immigrants, and with no Burmese citizenship rights. And many did flee for Bangladesh in 2017 after skirmishes with the Myanmar military. The UN has looked at this all as ethnic cleansing. Enter the Burmese way to socialism. There was a coup in 1962 that took the country in a direction of an army state, right? And prior to that, there was much infighting and mismanagement, taking the country. And this is a sad thing about some of these places. We'll look at it with Nigeria when we get to Africa. But Myanmar is, it had great health care, high literacy rates, an efficient civil service. And, the Burmese way to socialism under this army state brings it to complete collapse. Enter one of the most interesting political figures of the 21st century to me. Some might argue I spend maybe an inordinate amount of time on this person. 1990 elections ensued. As a result of mass demonstrations for democracy, the winner, a lady, Aung San Suu Kyi, a human rights advocate, was placed under house arrest, otherwise known as the lady. She was released in 1995, and she called for dialogue with the military, and she appealed to Parliament that was elected in 1990 to be convened. She was placed once again under house arrest and in prison, prompting the U.S. to levy sanctions against the country. Lady Sue has been, and I'm not going to cover all the times here, she's been placed under house arrest a lot. And I'm sure it's gotten to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if she has chuckled and thought, not again, But due to the Burma Spring, right? Some of you guys heard about the Arab Spring, the uprisings, kicking out thugs and dictators in the Arab world. The Burma Spring, around the same time period, 2011, the U.S. evaluated its sanctions that they had placed on Myanmar, and this included the release of political prisoners. Lady Sue was included in that release and promised elections, right? Lady Sue wins it in a landslide victory in the wake of the military's promise of free and fair elections. Now, this is very sad to me, and it's sad to the human rights community, but once in power, Lady Sue took an authoritarian posture. And she was at the helm in 2017's ethnic cleansing, I can't believe this, of the Rohingya Muslim group. Journalists were speaking out about it. She had them arrested, right? Very, very sad. And then in February of 2021, the Tatmadaw, the army state, they launched a coup against the Sioux government, including harsh punishment against protesters. Now, just kind of an FYI on that. Lady Sue was sentenced to 26 years in prison by the Tatmadaw in 21, and then in late 22, she went to trial again for corruption, and they added 7 more years too. Just very recently, right? I think it was December 22. They added 7 more years to her sentence, so it makes it grand total of 33 years. That she'll die there now. I think it included illegally possessing walkie-talkies, flouting COVID restrictions, and abusing state funds. I think she allowed one of her top lieutenants to maintain a helicopter. Kind of trumped up stuff. But so the situation has turned into what ASEAN sees as a crucial civil war during the armed resistance toward the military. Because there's armed resistance toward the Tatmadaw, Asians like, yeah, all right, this is a civil war now, and they are, may get involved in that. Vietnam, Saigon was named Ho Chi Minh City. Ongoing external conflicts shortly after the takeover. Vietnam's conquest of Cambodia to oust the Khmer Rouge, warfare against Cambodian and Laotian resistance groups, and a brief border war with China. And here's your set of notes. Repression toward those in South Vietnam who aided the Americans, resulting in a mass exodus of refugees. Good news, all right, good news. Vietnam completed a successful COVID-19 lockdown, registering the highest Asian economic growth in 2020 as a result of that. They adopted free market reforms in 1986. There was some dialogue with the Reagan administration during that time, which led the way to maybe opening the door to dialogue and economic aid and economic assistance to move to a free capitalist economy. President Clinton met openly with them during his presidency, and that kind of, opened the levees to a resurgence in Vietnamese economy. 1995 that was. Clinton's meeting with them, and they've adopted military ties as well with the United States, as we're all a little concerned about some of the shenanigans that the Chinese are involved with in the South China Sea. I know the Philippines are concerned about that as well. The economy in North Vietnam is still a little slow. Their leading employer is still the government in Hanoi. Indonesia, what's going on there? Indonesia, they deal with fragmentation, due to some things I talked about earlier with Aceh and over to the east of them, Papua New Guinea. Late 1990s, there was an economic crisis under the Suharto government. In Indonesia, a lot of overlending, government corruption. In 1999, after years of Portuguese and Indonesian occupation, East Timor, with the UN help, gained assistance, gained their independence. East Timor on page 310 is, again, hard to see. But East Timor is right here, right here in this. I have it circled here in my book. But so there you have it, East Timor. Might as well keep 310 open here. Brunei, haven't talked about them much. Brunei, north coast of Borneo. They struck it rich in oil and natural gas, and they gained independence from Great Britain in 1984. Here is Borneo here, and Brunei, not as populated, not as densely populated as the rest of the region. Farming changes in Southeast Asia. Economic crisis, again, overlending in Indonesia in the late 90s by banks there set off a financial crisis in the entire region. And that was certainly a domino effect. Farming changes in Southeast Asia. You have the Green Revolution, began in the mid-60s. It was a combination of new mechanization and irrigation to raise production. Just kind of a little FYI, that was kicked off by genetic modification. US food scientists in Mexico in the 1940s began studying this. Okay, and again, as a result of all this, you had higher yielding seeds and wheat, rice, and corn. Rice yields, in fact, doubled from 1969 to 1989 with all this new rice technology. Well, there you have that. So let's recap real quickly here and talk about what's up ahead. And get my screen share back up here. And we need to look at the graphic organizer. Take a look at that real quick. We saw the influences. We looked at the domino theory. ASEAN was set up as a consortium to check any communist advances in a region. We looked at the Khmer, Burmese, Thai, and Vietnamese empires. Muslims arrive in 1200 AD, settling in Malaysia and Indonesia. And then European colonies, right? The British are in Myanmar, the French in Indochina, the Dutch in Indonesia, the Spanish in the Philippines. Remember Myanmar, formerly Burma. Thailand was not affected or colonized. The mainland countries, Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, formerly Burma. You had your Burmese way of socialism in 1962, becomes democratic, and that ends up collapsing many get that out of there, many good things. 1990, Aung San Suu Kyi becomes the prime minister. Lady Sue takes authoritarian tone, ethnic cleansing and arrests. Almost once makes me want to break out a hanky when I talk about that. 2021, there's a coup against her government. Her government, Tatmadaw, take over again. Army, have an army regime. And then you got your island countries. 90s economic crisis on Indonesia, Suharto government, a lot of overlending and corruption, oil, gas on Brunei, and your Green Revolution. Vietnam, French invasion in 1856, Japanese oust the French in 1941, the Vietnamese nationalists mobilized against Japan, Japanese and French were expelled in 1954, US and China partition the peninsula, communists take over in 1975, and you have external conflicts with the neighbors. After the takeover, mass exodus of Vietnamese refugees. Vietnam has adopted free market reforms in 1986, fastest growing economy in Asia. All right, population dynamics, economic zones are set up in Vietnam to curb population problems. And you have persecutions in Vietnam, the boat people, ethnic Chinese or business people. 1977, 82, we have 75,000 people leaving the country. Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, Vietnamese and suspected sympathizers, 1.7 million die between 1975 and 1979. Okay, now get the screen share up there. Coming up ahead, nothing new apart from the videos. Videos, you have the boat people. Boat people videos about 4 to 5 minutes long. War damage to Southeast Asia, okay, after Vietnam. That's about 2 minutes long. And then the new generation, kind of encouraging video, perhaps, about Vietnam, the future for the Vietnamese homeland. That's entitled The New Generation. Okay. And there you have it. And again, any questions, comments, concerns, you guys know where to find me. And just have a tremendous week. And as always, do well. See you later.